The American Civil War ended in the spring of 1865, and the men who had fought it were finally going home. For thousands of Union soldiers who had survived both the battlefields and the Confederate prison camps, a steamboat on the Mississippi River was the last leg of the journey. They boarded on the night of April 26th, packed onto every surface of a white wooden vessel called the Sultana, and most of them were asleep by the time the boat pushed north into the dark. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the boilers exploded. More than 1,000 men died before sunrise. It is to this day the deadliest maritime disaster in the history of the United States, surpassing the Titanic by any honest count. Almost no one alive today has ever heard of it, and that fact is not an accident. To understand what happened on the Mississippi River on the night of April 27th, 1865, it is necessary to understand who was on that boat and what they had already been through before they ever set foot on the Sultana's deck. Because these were not ordinary passengers making an ordinary journey. They were men who had endured some of the worst conditions of the entire Civil War, and they were within days, in some cases hours, of reaching their families for the first time in years. The Civil War officially ended on April 9th, 1865, when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. 4 years of the most destructive conflict in American history came to a formal close. But the end of the war did not mean the immediate liberation of the tens of thousands of Union soldiers still held in Confederate prison camps scattered across the South. The news traveled slowly, and the logistics of releasing and transporting that many men required weeks of coordination. For the soldiers waiting in those camps, the end of the war was something they had heard about but could not yet feel in any physical way. The two prison camps most directly connected to the story of the Sultana were Andersonville in southern Georgia and Cahaba in Alabama. Andersonville was, by any measure, one of the most catastrophic military prisons ever operated on American soil. It had been designed to hold approximately 10,000 men, but at its peak in the summer of 1864, it held nearly 33,000. The physical conditions inside were almost beyond description. There was almost no shelter from the Georgia sun or the winter cold. There was almost no medicine of any kind. The men drank from and bathed in and used as a latrine the same small creek that ran through the middle of the camp. Thousands died of dysentery, scurvy, gangrene, and starvation. The death rate at Andersonville was among the highest ever recorded in any prison facility during the entire war, and the suffering of the men confined there became one of the defining moral indictments of the Confederacy in the years that followed. Cahaba was smaller, but its own kind of misery. Located on the banks of the Alabama River, it had been created inside a converted cotton warehouse that was never designed to house more than a few hundred people, and by the final months of the war, it held upward of 3,000. In the late winter of 1865, the Alabama River flooded, and the water rose through the floorboards of the prison and across the entire ground level of the facility. Of the 3,000 men confined inside, fewer than a third could find any ground above the waterline. The rest stood in cold floodwater for nearly 2 weeks, with nowhere to sit and nowhere to lie down. Many of the men who eventually walked out of Cahaba that spring were carrying permanent physical damage from those weeks in the water. When Confederate authorities finally issued orders to release their Union prisoners following Lee's surrender, the men began moving westward toward the Mississippi River on whatever transport was available. Many traveled by rail when rail lines still existed. Others went by wagon. Many simply walked across a landscape that 4 years of war had left scarred and stripped. Some of the men were in no condition to walk at all and had to be carried or supported by the men alongside them. Some were boys who had enlisted at 14 or 15 years old, young enough to have lied about their age or to have joined as musicians with parental permission, and who were now the veterans of things no one their age should have witnessed. After weeks of difficult travel, the former prisoners came down the bluffs above Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they looked out over the Mississippi River below them. Witnesses described the men beginning to shout when they saw the water. Some of them wept. The river was the road north, and north was home. Vicksburg in late April 1865 was a city still visibly marked by the long siege that had ended 2 years earlier. The streets were a mixture of recovery and ruin, and the docks along the river were crowded with steamboats of every size waiting for passengers and cargo. The government had contracted with private steamboat companies to transport the freed prisoners north, paying a fixed rate per man per distance traveled. The competition among boat captains for a share of that contract was sharp because the numbers were significant and the men were already on the docks waiting to board. Among the boats docked at Vicksburg in those final days of April were 3 vessels with the capacity and the inclination to take on passengers heading north. One of them was the Sultana. She was a 260-foot wooden sidewheel steamboat that had been built in Cincinnati 2 years earlier, designed originally for the cotton trade between St. Louis and New Orleans. She was fast enough that she had been awarded the coveted set of elk antlers mounted between her twin smokestacks, a recognized symbol on the lower Mississippi of the quickest boat on the river. Her captain and part owner was a 34-year-old businessman from St. Louis named James Cass Mason, who was proud of the boat's reputation and deeply aware that the prisoner transport business represented an extraordinary financial opportunity at exactly the moment when he most needed one. The Sultana had been certified to carry 376 passengers and crew. When the former prisoners began arriving at the Vicksburg docks on the night of April 24th, observers on nearby vessels noted that the Sultana was being loaded well beyond anything that could be considered normal. The men covered every available surface of the boat: the hurricane deck, the wheel housing, the forward rails, the outer guards. Emergency wooden supports had been brought on board and hammered beneath the upper deck because the sheer weight pressing down on it was causing the wood to visibly bend. A cotton merchant who was standing on an adjacent vessel at the time described the scene afterward in simple terms. He said that on every part of the Sultana, the men appeared to be packed as thick as they could possibly stand, with no space to move from one end of the boat to the other. The soldiers themselves, for their part, had spent months in conditions considerably worse than a crowded steamboat deck. Not one of them refused to board. The best estimates from historians who have spent years studying the Sultana disaster place the total number of people on the boat when she left Vicksburg at somewhere around 2,100, with nearly 2,000 of them being former prisoners of war. The official records were never accurately maintained, which is itself part of the story. What is certain is that the legal passenger capacity of the boat was 376. The Sultana pushed north against the Mississippi River running at full spring flood, and the going was slow. In some stretches, the water had spread 3 miles beyond its normal banks, and the current was strong and cold. Captain Mason knew the boat was carrying far more than it had been built for. He had to repeatedly ask the men not to rush to one side of the deck when they spotted a passing vessel or a farmhouse on the bank, because the sudden shift of so much weight caused the entire boat to lurch sideways, which in turn caused the water inside the 4 linked boilers to slosh dangerously back and forth. The men did not always listen, and the boat rocked its way north through the first day and into the second, engines working hard against the current. On the morning of April 26th, the Sultana made a brief stop in Helena, Arkansas, a small river town about 100 miles south of Memphis. A local photographer named T.W. Banks came to the dock and took a photograph of the boat from the waterline. That photograph still exists in the historical record, and it is a remarkable document. It shows the white hull of the Sultana rising from the river and covering nearly every surface of her. Pressed together on every deck and railing and rooftop are the men. Young men, thin men, dozens of faces turned toward the camera or looking past it toward some point to the north. It is the last photograph ever taken of the Sultana, and most of the men visible in it were dead within 24 hours. That same evening, the Sultana made a stop in Memphis to take on provisions. The city was quiet in the way of a place that had absorbed 4 years of wartime and was only beginning to understand that it was over. After Memphis, the boat crossed to the Arkansas side of the river to load coal, then turned north again into the dark. The men had grown quiet. The long journey and the press of bodies on the crowded decks had worn the energy out of even the most restless among them. By midnight, Most of the soldiers had put their heads down wherever they could find space on the wooden planking and close their eyes. 7 miles north of Memphis, the Mississippi was wide and dark and running hard past a cluster of small wooded islands. The boat was making reasonable time. It was 2 o'clock in the morning on April 27th, 1865, and almost every man on board was asleep. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers exploded within seconds of one another. The sound of the detonation reached the Memphis waterfront 7 miles to the south and was described by people who heard it as a single massive concussion, like a cannon blast, loud enough to shake windows and wake people from their sleep across the city. On the boat itself, there was no warning of any kind, no vibration, no building pressure that the sleeping men could have noticed. One moment, there were 2,000 people on a dark river. The next, the entire center section of the Sultana had been destroyed. The force of the explosion eliminated the middle of the boat almost instantly. The pilot house was blown entirely off its base. Both smokestacks came crashing down onto the crowded decks below. Iron fragments from the boiler walls were driven outward at tremendous velocity through the mass of men, and the pressurized steam that followed the initial blast moved across the packed decks in a wave, burning everything in its path. Men who had survived the physical force of the explosion and the shrapnel and the collapsed structures then found themselves on a burning boat with no navigation, no captain at the wheel, and no clear path to safety. The estimates gathered from survivor testimony and official reports in the years after the disaster suggest that approximately 400 people were killed within the first minute. The Sultana had been constructed almost entirely of dry pine, which was standard practice for Mississippi River steamboats in that era, and it burned with extraordinary speed. Survivors recalled afterward that the fire had spread from the center of the boat to both ends before most people had fully processed what had happened. The upper deck, which had been visibly stressed for 2 days under the weight of far more bodies than it was ever designed to hold, collapsed inward during the fire and came down on the men below. Those who were physically able to move in the chaos had one option available to them, and they took it. They went into the river. The Mississippi that night was cold, fast, and in full spring flood. The current was strong enough to carry a man downstream at several miles per hour without any effort on his part. A significant number of the soldiers on board could not swim, which was not unusual for men of their background and generation. Many of those who could swim had spent months in prison camps that left them physically depleted, with little strength in their arms and legs. The men in the water grabbed for anything nearby that could hold them up. Doors torn from their hinges, wooden shutters, deck planks, barrels, crates, any fragment of the burning boat that had been thrown clear and was floating on the dark surface of the river. Survivors gathered in the years after the disaster described clinging to pieces of debris for 2, 3, and 4 hours in the cold water, too numb to feel their hands but unwilling to let go. One survivor, a soldier named William Lugenbiel, found himself in the water near a large wooden crate that had been thrown clear of the wreck. The crate had contained the Sultana's live alligator, an animal the crew had kept on board as a kind of unofficial mascot. The alligator was gone, but the crate was solid and it floated, and Lugenbiel held onto it through the night until he was pulled to shore in the morning. He survived the disaster and spent the rest of his life commemorating it, carving alligator images into canes, pipes, and small wooden boxes that he gave to family and friends, each one a quiet reference to the thing that had kept him alive. Another man survived by floating nearly 10 miles downstream on the body of a dead mule that had been part of the boat's cargo and was thrown clear by the explosion. A survivor recalled that there was at least one person clinging to every tree along the flooded Arkansas shoreline. Men who had reached the bank and pulled themselves up into the branches and were singing songs or imitating the sounds of birds and frogs to let other survivors in the water know that they were not alone. Some of those men were too exhausted or too badly burned to call out at all, and simply held on in silence until a rescue boat found them. On the Arkansas shore, the glow of the burning Sultana was visible from a considerable distance, and local residents came to the bank within minutes of the explosion. Former Confederate soldiers, men who had been on the opposing side of the war just 3 weeks earlier, launched every small boat and skiff they could find, and rowed out into the flooded river in the dark. They did not pause to consider the politics of the situation. They pulled men from the water for hours, making repeated trips back and forth between the shore and the wreck site. Freed slaves living along the Arkansas riverbank did the same. One man is documented in multiple survivor accounts as having made so many trips across the cold water through the night that those watching eventually lost count. These rescuers asked no questions about the men they were pulling from the river. The war had ended, and there were people drowning. Rescue boats arrived from Memphis roughly 30 minutes after the explosion. The remains of the Sultana continued to burn through the early morning hours, and the wreck finally settled into the mud on the Arkansas side of the river as the sun was coming up. By that time, hundreds of bodies were already moving south on the current past the Memphis waterfront, and the city was waking to find the river carrying its dead. The survivors, somewhere between 700 and 900 of them, were transported to hospitals in Memphis. A great many had severe burns covering large portions of their bodies. Many had broken bones from falling debris, from the collapse of the upper deck, and from the force of the explosion itself. In the days that followed, dozens more died in the hospitals from their injuries. The final death toll from the Sultana disaster has never been precisely established, and the reason for that uncertainty goes back to the fact that no one ever produced an accurate count of how many people were on the boat. Historians who have studied the records most carefully place the number of dead somewhere between 1,100 and 1,800. The range is wide, and the uncertainty is significant, and it is not the result of incomplete record-keeping alone. The first account of the disaster to reach the outside world came from a teenage boy who had survived by floating on debris and came ashore at the Memphis waterfront in the early morning hours. He told the sentries what he had seen. The sentries sent word to the hospitals, and the hospitals sent word to the newspapers. But by the time the newspapers were preparing to print, the editors had already seen the other story that had come across the wire that same morning, and they made the decision that editors in that position always make. The Sultana would have to wait. To understand how more than 2,000 men ended up on a boat that had been certified to carry fewer than 400, it is necessary to go back to Vicksburg and back further than the night of the loading. The chain of decisions that put those men on that boat in that condition began weeks earlier, and it began with money. James Cass Mason had purchased a majority stake in the Sultana the previous year, and by early 1865, he was in serious financial difficulty. The wartime restrictions on commercial river traffic had made the Mississippi trade lean, and Mason had debts that a fast boat and a good reputation were not going to cover on their own. When the war began moving toward its conclusion in the spring of 1865, Mason understood that the prisoner transport business was going to represent the largest commercial opportunity on the river in years. The government was paying steamboat captains a fixed sum for every soldier delivered north, and with thousands of men waiting at Vicksburg, a single well-loaded trip could generate revenue equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars in present-day terms. Mason set out from St. Louis in mid-April with the clear intention of positioning himself to capture as large a share of that business as possible. 10 hours south of Vicksburg, while the Sultana was still heading downriver toward New Orleans, one of her 4 boilers developed a serious leak. The boat arrived at Vicksburg on April 23rd in a weakened condition, and a boilermaker was brought on board to assess the damage. The boilermaker's name was R.G. Taylor, and his assessment was straightforward. The ruptured seam needed to be cut out and replaced with new plate. Done correctly and safely, the repair would take 2 to 3 days. Mason told Taylor to patch it instead. A thinner sheet of iron was hammered over the rupture and riveted in place, a fix that took a single day rather than 3. Taylor informed Mason directly that the repair was not adequate for the conditions the boat would face. The historical record is clear on this point. Mason received that warning and proceeded anyway, because waiting 2 to 3 days meant the prisoners would be allocated to other vessels, and his opportunity would be gone. What Mason already knew before the Boilermaker ever set foot on the boat was that his opportunity was larger than the standard allocation process would normally have produced. Weeks earlier, on a previous stop at Vicksburg, Mason had been approached by the chief quartermaster of Union forces at Vicksburg, a man named Reuben Ben Hatch. The quartermaster was the officer responsible for assigning the freed prisoners to the available transport vessels, which meant that he effectively controlled which captains received the government contract and how many men each boat was given. Hatch's proposition to Mason was simple and corrupt. He would guarantee the Sultana a significantly larger load of prisoners than the boat could expect through the normal process, in exchange for a personal cut of the government payments Mason would receive. Mason agreed to the arrangement without hesitation. Both men were fully aware of the Sultana's certified carrying capacity when they made the deal. Understanding who Reuben Hatch was requires a brief account of his history within the Union Army, because his presence at Vicksburg in April 1865 was not the result of military merit. Hatch had been brought up on charges of graft and mismanagement multiple times during the war, accused on separate occasions of stealing government supplies and diverting public funds for personal use on a scale that would have ended most military careers permanently. Each time the charges came, they did not result in any lasting consequence, and the reason was consistently the same. Hatch's older brother, Ozias Hatch, was the Illinois Secretary of State and a member of the personal political circle of President Abraham Lincoln. Reuben Hatch had originally received his military commission as a patronage appointment arranged through his brother's connections to the president. When the courts-martial came, Lincoln personally wrote letters advocating for Reuben's continued service. General Ulysses Grant did the same. Those letters are preserved in the National Archives in Washington. Hatch kept his position, kept his rank, and continued operating in exactly the manner he always had. When the freed prisoners began arriving at the Vicksburg docks in the final days of April, 2 other steamboats were docked alongside the Sultana and were both available and capable of taking passengers north. They were the Pauline Carroll and the Lady Gay. Their captains watched with considerable anger as the entire prisoner allocation was directed to the Sultana, leaving their boats sitting empty at the dock. The officer who physically oversaw the loading of the men was a regular Army captain named George Augustus Williams, a West Point graduate who was aware that the distribution of passengers among the available vessels looked irregular. He raised the question of why the Pauline Carroll and the Lady Gay were not receiving any prisoners. His questions were deflected without satisfactory answers, but the loading continued under his supervision. The Sultana left Vicksburg carrying what was by any measure the largest human cargo ever placed on a single vessel on the Mississippi River, with a patched boiler, decks that were visibly sagging, and emergency supports that had been added as an afterthought. The engineering explanation for what happened 2 days later on the river has been examined and documented by multiple experts in the century and a half since the disaster. The 4 boilers on the Sultana were interconnected, and the water level inside them shifted continuously as the overloaded boat rocked in the current. Each time the boat lurched from a movement of so many bodies on the upper decks, the water inside the boiler system sloshed toward the low side, which left sections of superheated metal on the high side exposed to direct heat without the cooling effect of the water. Over 2 full days of running hard against a flooded current, those stress points built upon themselves. The patched boiler, already structurally compromised by a repair that its own maker had declared unsafe, was the most vulnerable element in the system. The result, when it came, was not the kind of accident that could have been prevented by luck. It was the direct physical consequence of a series of decisions that had already been made. The military investigations that followed the disaster produced a great deal of paper and very little justice. A court of inquiry convened by General Cadwallader Washburn concluded by exonerating Reuben Hatch of any meaningful responsibility. A separate investigation ordered by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reached the opposite conclusion, identifying Hatch as one of the most culpable individuals involved in the disaster and recommending that he be court-martialed. Before that court-martial could proceed, Hatch resigned his commission and left the Army with an honorable discharge. When he was subsequently subpoenaed 3 separate times to testify at the court-martial of another officer connected to the disaster, he ignored all 3 subpoenas without consequence. War Department officials noted in the formal record that his repeated refusal to appear was consistent with what they described as a consciousness of personal responsibility for what had happened. He was never compelled to appear and never faced any legal proceeding of any kind. Captain Williams, the officer who had physically supervised the loading of more than 2,000 men onto a boat certified for fewer than 400, was never charged. He was a regular Army officer and a West Point graduate, and the institutional protections available to men in his position proved sufficient. Captain Frederick Speed, who had organized the prisoner rolls at the parole camp but had not personally placed a single man on the boat, was court-martialed, found guilty, and then had his conviction overturned on precisely that technicality. Mason had drowned with his boat in the river he had overloaded. No one was ever convicted of any offense connected to the deaths of more than 1,000 men. No family of the dead received any official acknowledgement of the circumstances that had led to their loss. There is a question that almost every person asks when they encounter the story of the Sultana for the first time, and it is almost always the same question. Why have I never heard of this? The answer is not a single explanation, but several overlapping ones. And taken together, they describe something deliberate rather than accidental. The most immediate and straightforward reason is the timing of the disaster within a period already saturated with historic events. On April 26, 1865, the day before the Sultana exploded, John Wilkes Booth was tracked down and killed in a Virginia barn. Booth was the man who had shot Abraham Lincoln in Ford's Theater 12 days earlier, and the country had been waiting for news of his capture or death since the assassination. When the news arrived on the morning of April 26th, it dominated every newspaper in America. The grief and the resolution of the Lincoln story were the only things the public mind had room for that week. When reports of the Sultana disaster began reaching newsrooms on the morning of April 27th, editors made the calculation that editors always make, and the Sultana ran on inside pages in abbreviated form, if it ran at all. A Virginia newspaper that did give the story meaningful coverage observed that the nation had been conditioned by 4 years of mass casualties to absorb death with a degree of numbness that would have been unthinkable before the war, and that even so, the scale of the Sultana disaster was enough to disturb anyone who read about it carefully. The problem was that most people never did. Beyond the timing, there is the question of who the victims were. The men on the Sultana were privates and corporals from small towns and farming communities in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Tennessee, and Kentucky. They were not men of any public standing. They were not senior officers with reputations and networks and advocates in Washington. Their families lived in rural counties and small cities that had no political representation at the level where these decisions were made and where accountability for them might have been demanded. There was no senator whose son had been on the Sultana, no general whose brother had drowned in the Mississippi. The people with the institutional power to compel an honest reckoning had no personal reason to push for one, and so the push never came. Then there was the government's own exposure. The investigations had established clearly enough, for those paying attention, that the disaster was directly traceable to the conduct of an officer who had remained in his post for 4 years specifically because of his personal connection to the late president. Pursuing that finding in public, with the full weight of official inquiry behind it, would have required the government to explain, in precise detail, why Abraham Lincoln had repeatedly intervened to keep a documented corrupt official in a position where he was able to cause exactly this kind of damage. Lincoln had been dead for less than 2 weeks. He was already in the early stages of becoming what he would eventually be in American historical memory, a martyr, a saint of the Republic, the man who saved the Union. There was no political appetite in Washington in the spring of 1865 for a story that complicated that narrative, and there were people in a position to ensure that the story did not gain the traction it would have needed to complicate anything. The survivors of the Sultana did not accept the silence, and for as long as they were alive, they refused to allow the story to disappear entirely. In 1885, 20 years after the disaster, a group of men who had been on the boat gathered in Fostoria, Ohio, and established the National Sultana Survivors Association. They began meeting annually, rotating between a northern chapter centered in Ohio and a southern chapter that formed the following year in Knoxville, Tennessee. At each meeting, they read the names of the dead and the living, shared their accounts, corresponded with one another between meetings, and continued writing to newspapers and to Congress requesting that a formal federal monument be built to acknowledge what had happened to the men on the Sultana. Congress never built one. Among the most dedicated and persistent of the survivors was a man named John H. Simpson from the mountains of East Tennessee, who had been 17 years old and asleep on the third deck of the Sultana when the boilers exploded. Simpson had been captured by Confederate cavalry in 1864 and sent to Cahaba Prison, where he spent months before the war ended and the release orders came. He had made the overland journey to Vicksburg, boarded the Sultana, survived the explosion and the night in the river, and eventually made his way back to Knoxville. For the next 50 years of his life, he worked consistently and without recognition to ensure that the men who had died on the Sultana were remembered. He organized local gatherings of survivors, gave public talks, participated in the association's national meetings, and lobbied with particular persistence for a monument that the federal government would fund and maintain. That monument never materialized from Washington, and so the survivors built their own. On July 4, 1916, in front of approximately 100 people gathered on a hilltop cemetery at Mount Olive Baptist Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, John Simpson and his fellow survivors dedicated a marble monument to the dead of the Sultana. It was, by historical record, the last Civil War monument unveiled in the presence of actual Civil War veterans in the state of Tennessee. The reunions continued to grow smaller with every passing year. By the late 1920s, the number of men still living who had been on the Sultana had fallen to single digits, and attendance at the annual meetings reflected that. In 1929, a single man showed up to the Southern reunion in Knoxville. He sat in the meeting room, read the minutes of the previous gathering aloud to no one, signed the log, and drove home. He died 5 weeks before the anniversary the following year. By the early 1930s, only 2 men in the entire country were still making the trip to the northern reunions. The last survivor of the Sultana disaster was a private from Tennessee named Charles M. Eldridge, who had been on the third deck of the boat on the night of April 27, 1865, and had made it to the Arkansas shore. He died in Texas in September 1941 at the age of 96, 76 years after the explosion. He died 3 months before the United States entered the Second World War. With his death, the last living connection to the Sultana was gone. In 1982, a Memphis attorney named Jerry Potter organized a small archaeological expedition to the Arkansas side of the river, driven by years of research he had conducted into the historical river charts and the documented accounts of survivors and rescue workers. Using the information he had assembled, Potter's team identified a location in northeastern Arkansas that matched the available evidence for where the Sultana had come to rest. What they found was not the river. The Mississippi had shifted its main channel nearly 2 miles to the east in the 117 years since the disaster, and the site where the Sultana was believed to have sunk was now dry land, covered by a working soybean field. Survey equipment indicated a very large object buried approximately 30 feet below the surface of the field. Potter was not able to mount a full excavation, but the evidence he gathered left him with a high degree of confidence that the Sultana was there, beneath the soil of an Arkansas farm, carrying in whatever remained of her hull, whatever remained of the world that had been destroyed on the river that April morning. In 2015, on the 150th anniversary of the disaster, the Sultana Disaster Museum opened in Marion, Arkansas, a small city directly across the river from Memphis and as close geographically as any community gets to the site where the wreck is believed to lie. The museum is modest in scale, built on limited funding in a state that most travelers pass through without stopping, and it represents the most sustained institutional effort anyone has made to ensure that the Sultana is not forgotten entirely. Its walls display the name of every person known to have been aboard the boat on the night of April 27, 1865, a list of more than 2,000 names. Among the objects the museum holds are fire bricks from the Sultana's furnace, fragments of her wooden hull, and a small collection of hand-carved wooden combs that former prisoners had made for themselves while confined in the Confederate camps. Personal objects they had carried all the way from Georgia and Alabama to the Mississippi River. The Arkansas State Legislature designated April 27th as Sultana Remembrance Day in 2019. What the story of the Sultana ultimately documents is not a natural disaster or an unavoidable accident. The boiler that failed had been declared unsafe by the man who repaired it. The boat that sank had been loaded to 6 times its legal capacity by officers who knew the numbers. The investigation that followed was shaped and limited by the same network of patronage and political protection that had enabled the corrupt officer at the center of the story to remain in his position throughout the war. And the silence that followed the investigation was maintained, at least in part, because the full truth of what had happened was inconvenient for people who had the power to determine what the public would be told. None of those decisions were made by one person acting alone. They were made by a system, and the men on the Sultana paid for them. The last photograph taken of the Sultana shows her docked at Helena, Arkansas, on the morning of April 26, 1865. She is white against the sky, large and solid-looking, and covering every surface of her are the men who had survived Andersonville and Cahaba in years of war and the long walk to Vicksburg. Their faces are thin and their clothes are worn, and they are looking north. By the following evening, most of them were gone, and within 48 hours the country had moved on to the next story. 160 years later, the Sultana still lies under a field in Arkansas, and the names on the museum wall in Marion are still the best answer anyone has given to the question of who those men were and what was done to them.